for turning out. It is a wonderful, crisp evening when we still have beautiful leaves on the trees, both where I live in Rochester, New York, and here. The topic, the name we agreed to in this talk was Reviving Democracy in the Age of Trump. I have been worried about the state of our democracy for a very long time. Now, I'm not a politics reporter. I went out in 1976 when I was a national correspondent for the LA Times. I was the youngest national correspondent they had. Covered one campaign and went, okay, I see why people do this. No thanks. I'm a policy guy. And being a policy guy, one of the things that worried me as a young man was seeing a disconnect between what ordinary people would talk about as I would travel, and I traveled extensively, and what government was doing at every level, state governments, federal governments, and how much the people in positions of power in our governments, federal, state, local, were reflecting the interests of the dominant economic classes around them, not the large numbers of people. Now in Michigan, where I worked for 3 years in the state capitol as an investigative reporter for the Detroit Free Press, I did observe that the United Auto Workers had a lot more influence, that unions had a fair amount of influence. But everything else that I did, what I noticed was that there was diminishing influence from those institutions that should be representing people. In the 60s and 70s, there were religious groups dedicated to social justice and social policy that had their own multi-story buildings in New York or Chicago. A couple times people had me fly in to speak at these groups. And the last time I went to a meeting like this was the Presbyterian Church was working on a statement about tax justice. They were working in coordination with a group of Catholics and some Methodists and some Lutherans, and they were basically running it off a tabletop. There's just no other way to describe it. And by the way, the Presbyterian Church of the USA, at its annual meeting the fall after they did their report that I and other people were consultants on, passed by a big majority, but not unanimously, a statement about the role of the tax system in social justice. And so I wanted to get a copy, and I went to their website, and I couldn't find it. And so I have someone who does computer searches for me from time to time for my books, who's really better at this than I am, and I paid them to look, and they couldn't find it. So I called the head of the church, called the stated clerk. Couldn't get through. Called the PR people, never got a response. Finally went to one of the people who was involved in writing the report who said, I got a bunch of copies of it. I said, yeah, but where is it online? And it took more than a year, but eventually they made it readily findable online. I thought it spoke volumes about the fact that, well, we passed this thing, but we're really not into it. Now, to understand what's happened to our democracy, I have to go way back in time. We live in the Second American Republic. The first American Republic that we probably all got about 30 minutes of in school, the Articles of Confederation government, failed. I actually keep a copy of the Articles of Confederation. I have 2 copies in hardback. One is on my top of the toilet tank, which is where things get read, and the other sits next to my desk. And the Articles of Confederation was very much like our Constitution with a couple of key exceptions. We created the current America, the constitutional America, because of 2 failings in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation government had no power to tax. Now, most of you are old enough to remember the bumper sticker from the 60s, what if we funded the Pentagon with a bake sale? Yeah. Well, that's what we were doing. And guess what? It doesn't work. The federal government was financed by voluntary contributions from the 13 states. And secondly, there was no power to regulate commerce. So Massachusetts furniture makers would put tariffs on Connecticut furniture makers' products or wood from New Hampshire. And commerce got all messed up. within the country. And that just doesn't work. And there was actually some talk, not much, of, well, maybe we should be 13 different countries. What motivated us to get the Constitution, our Constitution, was a dispute over mud in the Delaware River. There had been an earlier dispute between Virginia and Maryland over navigation rights and duties because of shifting sandbars, or they're really mud bars, in the Potomac River, which is one of the muddiest rivers you will ever see. And the leaders of Virginia and Maryland met and they worked it out. They came to a solution. Pennsylvania, a state which had the largest building in the Western Hemisphere until the Pentagon was built, a state that was always trying to do things on the cheap. So instead of building like the New York Central, a railroad of one gauge that just went west, to save money, they built a railroad that went from Philadelphia to the Susquehanna River, which is literally a mile wide and about 4 feet deep. And then they had the passenger vehicles, which looked like metal gondolas from Venice, taken off, floated across, and then you got on a different gauge train. And they passed various laws that basically just drove all the business and entrepreneurial activities out of Philadelphia and up to New York. And they just couldn't reach an agreement with New Jersey and Delaware about what do we do about mud in the Delaware River. It's a much bigger river than the Potomac. And so a meeting was called of all the states in Annapolis to discuss this, and what happened was a coup d'etat. And we got our government, our Constitution. Well, the very first power we grant our Congress is the power to tax us, to get rid of the government by bake sale. Article 1, the legislative section of the Constitution, in Section 8, that's the part, the powers given to Congress. Section 9 is the powers denied to Congress. Clause 1, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect duties, taxes, and imposts. Now, I have been to conventions in rooms with over 1,000 people who all share a view that the federal government is a criminal organization, many of whom believe it's run by Jewish bankers in Puerto Rico, and that the IRS is actually a private corporation and other crazy things. And those people will tell you, well, yes, the Constitution's right. And the reason all the tax systems are illegal is that Congress doesn't collect them. Congress doesn't lay them. It has the executive do it. Therefore, it's unconstitutional. I mean, the stupidity of that is like beyond belief. But if you just literally read it out of context, the Congress shall have the power. That's the phrase they miss, the power, to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts. Well, back in the 1960s and 70s, we had this huge disruption over the war in Vietnam. Enormous popular opposition to this war, driven in good part by having a draft. And many, many government leaders were completely estranged from this. There were people who got elected because of it, and who wanted to end the war and worked to do it and to change our policies. But by and large, the establishment position was one that had little to do with the interests of most Americans. When the age of Reagan began, with his election in 1980, the era of the New Deal ended. And Ronald Reagan, you can love Ronald Reagan or you can hate Ronald Reagan, but you cannot reasonably deny that he was a leader, because he led the country in a whole different direction. And the direction he led us in, he was real upfront about it. He was very upfront and direct in economic terms. He said, the people who are creating the wealth in this country are not enjoying the fruits of their labor. Notice his use of that word, their labor, because of tax laws that take too much of it and make it too difficult. And we're going to change that. He's also a man, of course, who launched his campaign in a little town called Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is famous for one thing, the murder of 3 civil rights workers, and who, when asked about that, said, oh, I had no idea. Why else would you go to Philadelphia, Mississippi to launch your campaign except to send a little subtle message about racism? Well, we've been following, up until Trump, the Reagan plan. And if you listen carefully to what Republicans have been saying up until Trump, before they became the party of Trump, they were pretty consistent. They did not say it in the words I'm about to say it, but their messages had a very clear, focused plan. The reason the economy in America isn't doing better is the rich don't have enough. That's why they won't invest. They don't have enough money, the taxes are too high, the regulations are too deep, and they won't invest and grow the economy because of that. Now I have to tell you, I've searched all over this country. I've spent a great deal of the money of the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times and my book royalties trying to find people who actually fit that model, and they're unicorns. They just don't exist. It's like the argument that businessmen don't do deals because they'll have to pay taxes. You know, as the former head of Alcoa, who was George W. Bush's first Treasury Secretary, Paul O'Neill, said, I never made a business decision in my life, and I don't know any business leader who did, based on the taxes I'd have to pay. Your object is to make the profits. And that's what classic economics teaches, that you want to maximize profits. Then you worry about taxes. The Republicans, by the way, also have a very clear plan, which Mitch McConnell has been incredibly clear about in recent days, for how to get more to the rich. You cut their taxes, you give them subsidies, and you restrain competition, which I wrote a trilogy of best-selling books about. Perfectly Legal on taxes, Free Lunch on hidden subsidies to rich people, and the fine print about monopolies, duopolies, oligopolies, and restraint of trade. And the way you get that money for the rich is you go after children, the disabled, the elderly. You go after people who can't fight back. And what did Mitch McConnell say this week? The reason the budget deficit grew 17% is entirely because of what he called the very popular entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. They didn't go up 17% last year. They didn't go up anywhere near that. What went up was the red ink to cover the Trump Republican tax plan, of which 80% of the benefits go to people in the 1%. That's basically people who make about $600,000 a year and up. And more than half of it will go to people who make over $2 million a year, which is the top 1 in 1,000 families. And really should be the focus. The campaigns in this country shouldn't be the 1%. They should be the 1 in 1,000. And the reason for that is, if you look at the bottom half of the 1%, they're all doing well. I'm not worried about them one bit. But the bottom half of the 1% are overwhelmingly two-income professional couples. A doctor married to a lawyer, an executive married to a successful business owner, a school superintendent in an urban school district married to a homicide detective. All, by the way, actual cases that I know. And those people work all year long to make within the 1%, to make about $600,000 a year. They're doing fine. But they're not clipping coupons, and they are, by and large, not capitalists. They're highly paid workers. Well, the Republicans have done another thing before Trump came along, and it was a growing, blatant appeal to racism. Now, let me go across the pond to Northern Ireland. Remember when we had the war going on in Northern Ireland? It was really horrible. You know, people were being murdered in the streets, restaurants were being blown up, police officers were being assassinated. It was truly awful. And the British basically came to the view that, well, this issue will eventually, for Northern Ireland, resolve itself through democracy. Because the Protestants were having 1 or 2 children per marriage, and the Catholics were, you know, they were like me. I'm not Catholic, but I have 8 kids. And this will cure this problem. All we have to do is tamp down the violence, and eventually people will vote to do whatever they want. Well, in this country, starting in the 1970s that I know of, it may have been earlier, professional Republicans, and by that I mean, the consultants, the advisors, the people who make their living, both parties have professions. They started saying, and there are news articles I read back then at the time, that the demographics of the country are going against the Republican Party. It has to stop being a party that is so overwhelmingly white. There was a phrase I learned back then, country club Republican. A phrase, by the way, every time I tried to put in the New York Times, it was denounced by editors. You can't say that. And I'd say, but this is a meeting at a country club, a bunch of people who belong to a country club, they're Republicans. No, we can't do that. It's pejorative. Even got somebody in a quote to say it once, and the quote was turned into a paraphrase. But there were consultants who were telling people, California by 2020 will be a majority, non-majority state. And it is. Anglo-Californians are less than half the population now. And one of the solutions was obviously, we'll have more kids. Of course, having more kids is expensive, it takes time, it takes commitment, a little harder to afford a Rolls-Royce convertible, maybe your own private jet, or a lot of time at the country club playing golf. And so the Republican professionals, realizing they were not going to get the demographic change that would have been helpful, then began a whole series of campaigns to reduce the franchise. One of the whole core of the civil rights movement in this country was expanding the franchise. A few of you in this room may be old enough to remember something I saw as a junior high school student on the Today Show when it did news instead of Balderall. And it was they were giving in Mississippi, people who registered to vote who were black had to pass, or everybody had to pass, a constitution test. So they would ask, white farmers who were virtually illiterate something like, who's the president of the United States? And then they'd pass. And then they would ask pretty tough questions of black Americans. And there have been published articles about some of the questions. They're absurd. So a lawful resident of Mississippi who was black went and failed the test. And they said on the TV show what the question was. And I know I was a junior high school kid when we were studying the Constitution that year. And I knew the answer. And shouted it out. My father was very pleased. And then the Today Show revealed that the guy who was denied the right to vote was a professor of constitutional law at learned from Harvard or Yale at Columbia, but one of the premier law schools in the country. But he was black and he was from Mississippi, and they flunked him. And throughout the civil rights movement, we saw this expansion of the franchise, of more people being able to vote. Everybody in the room who's roughly my age knows that we fought to lower the age of voting to 18. If you can go die in Vietnam, you should be able to vote. I didn't get to vote until I was 22 because of how the timing worked out, but 23 actually. But be that as it may, we lowered the voting age. The Republicans have been subtly undoing this. And now that we have left the age of Reagan and entered the age of Trump, which is simply a cult led by a third-generation career criminal, head of a white-collar crime family, a man who has no conscience whatsoever, and I've covered Donald along with anybody else in America more than 30 years. I've studied him. I have thousands of pages of documents about him. Everything I predicted about him before the election has come true, with one exception. I just never imagined that the Republicans would just fold. There'd be no oversight, no questioning, no pursuit. Well, now that Trump is in, and he has a blatantly racist platform, flat out, unquestioned racism. This is not George W. Bush, who went every year to a Ramadan breaking the fast dinner when he was in the White House. This is not John McCain, who said to the woman during the campaign, no, Barack Obama is not a Muslim from Kenya, he is a fine man. This is a racist, misogynistic criminal. So today, I tweeted about Dodge City, Kansas. If you live in Dodge City, Kansas, 27,000 people, majority Hispanic population, in order to vote, you literally have to get the hell out of Dodge. There is not one polling place in Dodge City, Kansas with 27,000 people. In fact, you all have to go to a single location, more than a couple of miles outside of town, and the nearest bus stop for the municipal bus system is a mile from the polling place. In Georgia, where Kemp, the Republican candidate for governor, is in charge of the election because he's the Secretary of State that oversees the voting mechanism, he has apparently removed about 1.2 million people from the polls, from the polling list in the last 4 years. There's only 10 million people in Georgia. And he has removed recently 53,000 people, put their voter registrations aside. 70% of them are African American. There are polling places where people have voted for forever that are not in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but everybody's voted there. There's been no litigation over it. They've said, oh no, we can't have that anymore because they're not complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act. They're just suppressing the votes of people they don't want. There are efforts to keep college students from voting. In 2012, in Ohio, there were poor people's districts, or heavily college districts, like Oberlin, the second most liberal college in America after Antioch, where if you wanted to go vote, you had to stand in line for 4 more hours. There's a calculated campaign that is being described in the press as making voting difficult or denying the franchise. I think that's much too mild. There's a calculated campaign to destroy our democracy. The Republicans know that they cannot be the majority. They can only rule if they can maintain power by keeping people from voting and by having an ideologically oriented Supreme Court that will support their rule. And look what happened when the Voting Rights Act came up before the Supreme Court a few years ago. Section 1 was tossed out. And Chief Justice John Glover Roberts said, that was for another era, those conditions have passed, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And literally the day that the opinion became public, bills are being drafted and introduced to deny the franchise to African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinos. In North Dakota, it is common practice throughout this country on many Native American people's reservations. And Native American peoples they're vanquished nations. They are independent nations who we recognize as a matter of law, but that we vanquish. And they live under our protection. And they're American citizens and they have the right to vote, but they also have the right to their own local government within certain geographic boundaries. And in many of these places, no one has a street address. You have a post office box. Your government-issued ID from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a federal agency, has forever used your post office box as your address. Well, North Dakota wiped all those people out saying you don't have a street address and we're worried about voter fraud. And the US Supreme Court just upheld that they can deny you if you don't have a street address. It turns out that the state was very clever about this. The Dakotas are about the reddest part of the whole country, even more than West Virginia. And they